What bothers me is we are months and months out from October the 7th, and certain things are being set in stone, and we are being told we cannot talk about them. You are a denier. You're a conspiracy theorist.
We can also talk and discuss and have a serious conversation about what actually happened on October 7th, because I don't think that truth has an expiration date. History is made to be revised and analyzed and criticized and scrutinized.
Yeah.
And the fact that you put a limit on what you talk about, this is actually against what this country is all about.
I'm Mehdi Hasan.
I'm Bassem Youssef.
And we're not kidding.
No, we're not.
Azadeh podcast.
We're not. We're not kidding. Because the rest of the media is. Because the rest of the media is full of nonsense.
Bassem's excited today. Bassem,
I am
good
very.
to see you. It's been a few weeks.
Very.
Good to be back in person with you here in LA again.
Yes.
I'm on the West Coast.
Thank you.
This is the podcast where funny people talk about serious things, but also funny things.
But
Today,
also serious people talk about ridiculous things, which we have been seeing in the media.
I'm the serious person. You're
Well,
the funny
I
person.
think in that case, I mean, the rest of the media is very clownish, and we need to discuss very, very serious issue today.
It's a very serious issue, and wherever I go, people say we don't talk about October the 7th enough.
So today we're talking about October 7th.
And we're going to talk about some of the issues that we've had with the discourse around October the 7th. We are now nearly 9 months out from October the 7th. You and I have done a lot of media, I think it's fair to say, since the 7th of October. Me, when I was at MSNBC, since leaving MSNBC, I've done a ton of interviews, podcasts, did a debate recently, didn't go so well. You have done more podcasts than I have had hot meals, and I eat a lot of hot meals. I've seen you argue with people on multiple continents about October the 7th.
And the one thing that they tell me is like, why don't we speak about the hostages? So today, I want to speak about the hostages.
Okay.
I want to speak about what the terrible thing that happened to the Israeli citizens and civilians on that day on October 7th.
So I do want to do a bit of it. I do want us to do a bit of a debunking of some certain stuff. Sensitive topics.
Yes.
Right? Sensitive topics. I want to talk about civilian casualties. I want us to talk about some of the awful things that were said that turned out to be untrue regarding babies, for example. We're also going to talk about sexual violence, which is a topic people try and avoid because it is so sensitive and explosive and controversial, and you get shouted at. We've got a great guest who's going to help walk us through this topic.
We have an expert.
An expert, a true expert. That word is thrown around. Azadeh Moaveni. She's a journalist, a war correspondent, a professor of journalism, and she ran the gender program at the International Crisis Group. She's written very eloquently and passionately and informatively on this subject.
So she's an expert and she knows what she's talking about.
There is a lot of stuff that's been said, some true, some not true, and some just unproven that we may never know. And what bothers me is that we are months and months out from October the 7th, and certain things are being set in stone, and we are being told we cannot talk about them. You are a denier, you're a conspiracy theorist. And I just want to be clear, I am not one of these people who denies what happened on October 7th. I'm just going to put my cards on the table. From day one, I was horrified by what happened on October 7th.
Yes, but we can also talk and discuss and have a serious conversation about what actually happened on October 7th, because I don't think that truth has an expiration date. It's not like, oh, after 3 months, you can not talk about it any day. History is made to be revised and analyzed and criticized and scrutinized.
Yeah.
And the fact that you put a limit on what you talk about, this is actually against what this country is all about, which is free speech.
It's actually what leads to conspiracy theories,
Yeah.
right? 9/11,
If you tell people you cannot talk about it, people will just come up with
9/11 conspiracy theories. I remember 9/11, how conspiracies spread, including in the Muslim community, hugely. And that was partly because George Bush, Dick Cheney did try and cover up their own idiocy and ignorance and incompetence and their weaponizing of the tragedy
But
for
let's
their own
talk about
military goals.
let's talk about Israel 9/11. Let's talk about October 7th. What happened on that?
And I just want to say something very clearly, because I have these arguments with people. I don't know, you agree, disagree, no comment. My position on October 7th is what Hamas did was horrific. What I saw was horrific. It is one of the great crimes of recent years. It is, I will use the T word, people might not like it. These are acts of terror. They terrorized the people in Israel. They didn't just kill soldiers.
Yeah,
they
of
killed
course.
civilians.
Yeah,
and I'm going to be talking a lot today
It's
about
a terrible act of terror in retaliation of acts of terror that Israel has been doing
There's no
all over
debate
3 years,
that-
of course.
There's no
And
debate
I'm not
that the world
defending.
didn't begin on October the 7th. We
Yeah.
both agree on that.
Yeah.
But I'm going to be leaning heavily on the conclusions, Bassem, today of the UN Commission of Inquiry report that just came out that the Israelis hate.
But Israel doesn't care about the UN.
But I do. So the UN Commission is very, very fair. It does call out Israeli war crimes. It calls out Hamas war crimes. It makes clear that both sides deliberately killed people. And on October the 7th, they didn't just kill soldiers. They killed civilians. And that's a war crime. They took children hostage. That is a war crime. And what amazes me and why I want to talk about this episode today is October the 7th was bad enough in and of itself without what some on the pro-Israeli side did to weaponize it, to justify their own atrocities since, their own genocide in Gaza since. And as you say, the idea that you just suppress talking about events and that we're not as journalists, as writers, artists, able to talk about the horrors of that day because they're closed off, I think is absurd. So I'm glad that you wanted to talk about this subject.
I was on this podcast with this like Adam Sosnick guy, the PBD, the guy who, when I told him like, listen, there's something called the Hannibal directive. I was like, what is this? What's the Hannibal directive? It's like basically what happened is that the Israeli military went in and they have killed unintentionally, indiscriminately, a lot of folks. Like, oh, are you telling me that Israelis are killing their own? That's ridiculous. Like, look it up.
So Hannibal has been on my mind a lot recently.
Yeah, and because when I said it's like, what? Do you mean Hannibal Lecter?
So it's funny you should mention-
because here's the thing. Why? And it's like, oh, that's very, very, very interesting because why save anybody where you can eat everybody? It's
So
like
Hannibal-
it's an open buffet for killing.
It's funny that you say Hannibal Lecter because Donald Trump.
I didn't
recently-
come here
Did
to
you-
save. I came here to
Did
eat.
you see the Donald Trump rally a few weeks ago?
No.
Where he praised Hannibal Lecter.
Oh, interesting.
No joke. Donald Trump, former president of the United States, wants to be president again. He praised Hannibal Lecter as an amazing guy, as if he's still alive. The guy's a cannibal and a serial killer. But it's funny that
Maybe
Hannibal...
no, I have an explanation. Maybe
Go on.
he heard that Hannibal is something that Israel does, and as we know, Trump loves everything that Israel does. So without even knowing, it's like Hannibal is a great guy. Who is it? Oh, he
well,
eats people.
the Hannibal directive. We're going to start the show today talking about the Hannibal
Who's
directive.
Hannibal?
So Hannibal is not Hannibal Lecter. Hannibal was a Carthaginian general in the second
Carthaginian
century.
from Carthage. From Carthage. So, okay.
And he fought with the Romans, famously took his army across the mountains. But what a lot of people don't know is that when the Romans had him surrounded, they were coming for him. He did not want to become a Roman prisoner and he poisoned himself to death. He committed suicide. By the way, the Israeli commanders in Lebanon in the 1980s, a couple of Israeli commanders come up with this doctrine called the Hannibal Directive. Hezbollah takes Israeli soldiers hostage. And the Israeli commanders come up with a plan to say, if Hezbollah is going to take our soldiers hostage, we don't want them hostage. We get them back at all costs. They say they didn't name it after Hannibal, the Carthaginian general.
So maybe they did name him after Hannibal Lecter.
So let me just read
I was right. It's a buffet for killing.
Although, was Hannibal Lecter around in the 80s? I don't even know. My history and fiction is now merging into one.
No, Silence of the Lambs, man.
I'm going to read it out to you. During an abduction, this was the doctrine as originally passed in the 80s. During an abduction, the major mission is to rescue our soldiers from the abductors, even at the price of harming or wounding our soldiers. Light arms fire is to be used in order to bring the abductors to the ground or to stop them. In any event, everything will be done to stop the vehicle and not allow it to escape.
As a matter of fact, there is a soldier who was quoted saying like, well, I saw them like running away, so I thought like instead of them falling into captivity, I thought to kill them. That's exactly what happened on October 7th.
So before we get to October 7th itself, they have this doctrine. It's the 1980s. It's very controversial. They've never published the full text of it. 2016, after they carry it out in Gaza, do you remember the 2014 Gaza war that we've just memory hold all the previous assaults on Gaza? Towards the end of that, an Israeli soldier was taken hostage by Hamas, taken into Gaza. The Israelis went in and killed hundreds of people, according to Amnesty International, as part of the Hannibal Directive, openly using it. After that, they rescinded it. 2016, it was officially revoked. And yet on October the 7th, we now know, according to the UN report, which came out last week, the UN says the Hannibal Directive was used on October 7th. Bassem, break down for us. You've been following this very closely over the last few months. What kind of things did the Israelis do on October 7th, which led to the deaths of their own civilians? Because remember, 1,400 is the death toll, right? It's then lowered to 1,200. Of the 1,200, 700, I believe, are civilians.
739.
And some of those civilians, we don't know how many because the Israelis weren't doing independent
but
investigation. Some of them were killed by Israel.
Here's interesting. Like, okay, I know there's a lot of information about this, but the fact that, like, as I said, like one of the soldiers said, like, I saw a vehicle running away with the hostages, so I thought of, like, shooting them and killing them instead of them falling in captivity. And then I thought, it was like, this is a very, very efficient soldier. So he would think, it's like, wait, if they are dead, there are no hostages. And if there is no hostages, there is no need for an extra rescue mission, so I don't need to go to another shift. This is how effective. So basically, he's cutting down his work from the source. If there's no hostages, no, basically, this is Israel. You know, when Israel tells you we do not negotiate with terrorists, so their idea of not negotiating is eliminating the negotiation by eliminating the hostages in the first place. So if there's no hostages, there's nothing to negotiate about.
It's interesting you should mention that, because the incident that the UN talks about in its report, which a lot of media have covered over the months, mainstream American, by the way, American British media has not covered any of this stuff. Israeli media's covered it.
Yeah.
Bloggers and activists, especially on the pro-Palestinian side, have covered it. Our media here in the United States, completely silent.
You know what does it sound like? You know, like people like doing bro language. It's like, hey, I'm with my girlfriend and I need you to verify everything, and your bro will lie for you. Like America is Israel's bro. It is lying for Israel on behalf of us. And Israel's like, I think you're going too much.
Even the Israelis are talking.
The Israeli
I
media.
always find it fascinating.
The Israeli media have talked about the Hannibal directive many times on their media. They even had a girl. Her name is Yasmin Borat. She's one of the hostages. She was locked in a house where 40 terrorists were locking in 14 hostages, and they said we were shot and we had like Israeli tanks firing on us, killing everybody. And she came on a podcast and said that. And the American and the British media, nothing.
No.
This is the best bro cover-up I've ever seen in my life.
So what's interesting, Bassem, is, and why I think we need to talk about on this show today, is you have the UN report comes out. It says the Hannibal directive was applied. It refers to the Yasmin Porat incident in Kibbutz Be'eri, where Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other fighters carried out some of the worst atrocities. They took hostages into a house and they said they want to negotiate to get out. The Israelis, a general turns up called Barak Hiram, I think his name is, and he's a settler, by the way. Some of the generals on the day were hardcore messianic Israeli soldiers.
Barak what?
Hiram, I think.
Haram.
My pronunciation's horrible. I apologize to my Israeli friends.
So he did something that's totally haram.
Oh my
and
God.
he would go in and you kill everyone. Listen, Mehdi, listen, I know that you're very happy with your facts. I don't care. Okay. I don't care, because this is bullshit. I'm done. No, I'm done. I'm done even trying to make sense of all of this. The fact that the Israeli military shows up and kill everybody is like when your house catches fire and the fire department shows with flamethrowers. This is like how ridiculous it is. It's like I imagine someone like Yasmin Bright sitting there, it's like, oh, the military are here for the hostages. No, we're here for collateral damage. This is how bad it is.
And I just want to be clear, Bassem, just to back you up, the general who turns up gives the order to say, and this is reported in the media, he says, go in, shoot, even if civilians die, right? This is his order. And some other Israeli soldiers who were on the ground have told Haaretz and other Israeli media that they were shocked at that order. And 13, by the way, the families of the people who died in Kibbutz Be'eri have complained to the Israeli government. They've demanded an investigation. One was done quickly, which cleared the general and cleared the colonel.
Did they give the general 1 star?
They cleared him.
Did they give them
You'll
1
be
star?
shocked to
There's
hear.
like what kind of did they give their evaluation for the service? Like, can you imagine anywhere in the world, like your military service, like, thank you for your service, thank you for your service, except in Israel, thank you for your service. Your service is not. We were better off before you guys showed up. This is how bad. And here's the thing. Here's what I'm interesting. It's kind of like Israel is so jealous that Hamas killed more civilians on that day than they would normally do on one day. Like Israel's like, no one get to kill civilians other than us. It's kind of like there's like the day will not end until our body count is higher than yours. So we gotta go in and finish the job. This is how it's like. Why is Israel's first response about everything is killing civilians?
Yeah, that day...
You go into Gaza, we kill civilians.
Well, we
go in to save our own people, we kill civilians.
But what's interesting is the Hannibal directive itself, and again, I want to make this clear because people will say, you're being unfair to the Israeli military, they were trying to save lives, it was a chaotic day.
Oh,
no, it was a chaotic day.
Yeah,
right?
Of course, yeah.
Hamas have breached their defenses. It's the biggest Israeli security failure in history.
The
fact that Hamas are even there, they're going into a place like Kibbutz Be'eri where hostages are held. And they are, I just want to quote. So there's a guy called Asa Kasher, who's a philosopher, Bassem. He's the guy who came up with the IDF's Code of Ethics. What's that? Code of Ethics. They actually have one.
That's the biggest geopolitical oxymoron I've ever heard in my life. IDF Code of Ethics
and even he
in
says,
one sentence.
And even he says the Hannibal directive did exist. The original order does not allow for you to kill an Israeli citizen. So he's saying he wants an investigation too. Even he thinks what happens on October 7th.
How dare you kill Israeli civilians instead
of Palestinians? The IDF is only for
Palestinians?
killing Palestinian civilians. Get it right? I mean, Bassem, there are so many examples that just haven't really been covered in the West. They have been covered in Israeli media and in some left websites of the Hannibal directive on October 7th. In a statement given to an Israeli news channel, a tank driver and a commander said they targeted 2 Toyota vehicles with militants and Israeli civilians inside of them. He said, I prefer stopping the abduction, so they won't be taken. I prefer killing them to stopping them from being hostages and released freely.
I said, like, he's trying to save one more shift.
Captain Bar Zonshine says that he fired tank shells at vehicles driving towards Gaza. He said, I decided it's the right decision. It's better to stop the abduction.
I feel late dinners, walking on beach and firing at vehicles.
I feel that I acted correctly, he says. And then Colonel Nof Erez.
I think the hostage was like his cousin and he hated him.
Yeah, there's some personal beef. Colonel Nof Erez says it was don't take our words for it, the 2 brown dudes. He says it was a mass Hannibal event on 7th of October.
A mass Hannibal
event. Lots of shooting going on. And look, anyone can read the UN report for themselves. They lay out the examples we talked about.
Who cares about UN?
We talked about the kibbutz berry, yeah. Well,
nobody cares.
They don't care, but some of us care.
Listen, Israel has always been playing international limbo. It's like when international is like how low can we get? It's like not low enough. This is how low they get. They always go low. I mean, Israel interpretation of international law is my daughter's interpretation of her bedtime. It works when it suits her.
Yep.
So it's just like it really doesn't matter anymore.
And I interviewed Mark Regev, Bassem, you may remember, a few months ago, and he said that they had lowered the death toll from 1,400 to 12. It was the first time the Israeli government admitted this, because 200 Hamas fighters were mixed in with the civilian counts. They realized those burned bodies were Hamas fighters. And the question at the time was, well, who burned the Hamas fighters? They didn't burn themselves. And if 200 Hamas bodies were killed by Israel, how do we know how many other bodies were killed by Israel? And again, I'm not saying that Israel killed most or all of the people on October 7th. I just want to be clear before it's clipped out of context. I'm saying Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and those groups created the scenario, created the conditions.
When those people, their only answer is only kill civilians. I mean, when they go to Gaza and they kill civilians, it's collateral damage. When they do it to their own people, that's not collateral. That's not collateral damage. That's just damage.
Yeah.
That's what they do. They just damage. They go in and they kill and they have absolutely, and then they go in and they cry and they victimize themselves about how many hostages and how many people were killed. And there's absolutely, if I was an Israeli father, I would like to know who killed my son.
And they have. And Hadass Dagan is one of the people who survived that attack on the house in Kibbutz Be'eri. And she wants answers. A lot of people want answers. What went on?
I mean, who wants answer when everybody can be called anti-Semite?
But what's interesting is these are Israelis, by the way, Israeli Jews who want answers. But the Israeli government keeps saying we're going to do a full investigation after the war is over. Yeah, Could that be why the war is never over? Could that be why it keeps dragging out? Because Benjamin Netanyahu knows he needs to have an investigation. What annoys me, Bassem, as a journalist, is I don't expect the Israeli government to do an investigation, but I do expect media organizations to do an investigation. Since the UN put out their report last week where they confirmed the Hannibal directive was used, they identified people who were killed, they identified cars that were attacked. Do you know how many British or American newspapers or news organizations have covered the Hannibal directive?
0.
One.
Who?
The Telegraph, the right-wing newspaper in the UK.
Does anybody
but
read
they did it in a way that criticized the idea that you would say this. So there's no coverage of Hannibal. No coverage of what might have happened on October 7th. You would think that if it is the biggest terrorist attack, the 9/11 of our time, you would think there would be a lot of media coverage of what actually happened on the day, and there isn't, right? You and I have to sit on a podcast and tell people...
Why don't we talk about October 7th the way that we want you to talk about?
Exactly. Let's talk about October. Let's talk exactly. So let's talk about also what came out of October the 7th.
No, I'm so sorry. I have to stop you here first.
Go on.
Let's talk about the response of the IDF. Let's talk because Israel is a country that is funded by the United States and it's funded to keep security and to protect its people. Let's talk about the response of the IDF. It took 6 hours for IDF forces to come and reach the kibbutz. 6 hours. Israel, for people who don't know, is as small as New Jersey. It is that small and it's that horrible. It's as small as New Jersey, right? And in that small area, they have more military bases and more airfields than America has a Starbucks, and it is everywhere. The response time in a place like this that is heavily populated with military bases should be less than 5 minutes. It took them 6 hours. 6 hours. Did they stop to ask for directions? Well, I mean, were they using an old Garmin GPS? What the hell? Were they following the North Star and get lost? How can it take... I could have watched the last season of Succession in those 6 hours. 6 hours to reach, and we are supposed to pay for that kind of service?
By the way...
I mean, I'm fine. I mean, kill all Palestinians. I don't care. Kill everybody. But at least if I'm paying for a service, for a military, they should just like come up with like a better service.
You said that, did they stop for directions? Maybe they were using Waze, which is founded
no,
by an
even
Israeli.
Waze will get you faster. No. Waze, yes, but even Waze will say you like, it's like, even Waze will say like, I think you're too slow.
One day we will find out why it took so long. But as I say, the Israelis are not interested in investigation. The Israeli media is asking questions, and the Western media is absent. And so we're sitting on a podcast in Los Angeles in 2024. In June of 2024, we're sitting in LA doing a podcast called We're Not Kidding. And we're having to talk about stuff that's in a UN report, but it's not in any of our media organizations.
Maybe in California, I can understand why they took so long. You know?
Go on.
No, because they took the scenic route.
Okay. I thought you were just going to say LA traffic.
They took the scenic route. No, they took the scenic. No, when you can go from Los Angeles to San Francisco in 5 hours or in 7 hours. It depends on like what route you get. So if you get the scenic route,
the tanks were taking the scenic route. So we want to talk about October 7th, as you very well put it, only the way we want to talk about it. So we're talking about civilian casualties in a way that a lot of people don't want to hear about it. Yes, Hamas is responsible for putting those people in danger. I'm not going to dispute that. But the Israeli military, we don't know how many people they killed on the day. We know they killed some. We know that Israeli families are upset about it, and we know that the media doesn't cover it. Then we have the fallout from October 7th, where we're hearing about the atrocities. Horrible things have happened, and yet for some reason, I can't imagine why, Israeli military, Israeli officials, some journalists, and the American government decide to make shit up.
In my mind, it will always live the testimony of Antony Blinken, the highest ranking U.S. official in front of Congress, when he described this scene about a group of Hamas terrorists went in, raped the woman, cut off her breast, gouged the eyes of the father, amputated the limb of the daughter, and cut off the finger of the little child, and then they sat down having breakfast. Who have the luxury to do that in a war zone? And also, where's the IDF during all of that? So we are supposed to believe that actually happened. No, that was debunked. That is the story that actually primed the world to accept and turn a blind eye for the horrible killing of it. But I have a few questions. First of all, that guy, Antony Blinken, never apologized for that.
Nope.
This was actually refuted many times, even by the Israeli media themselves.
Yep.
And he never took it back. And also, as a doctor, you know how hard it is to cut into breast tissue, into human tissue, using a box cutter? Like like you guys, like, are we fucking stupid? Are you talking to little kids? Even bedtime stories are more believable than this.
So, on the subject of believable, unbelievable stories, the big one was babies beheaded.
Yeah,
40 of them.
Yes, and Joe Biden saw pictures. He said, and when the White House was asked, what about the pictures?
They walked it back immediately. So it was this. So what I get is, and we're going to talk a little bit about Zaka.
But Biden lies the whole time.
By the way, let's talk about Zaka, by the way, in context. So there's a group called Zaka, for those of you who don't know, religious volunteers, ultra-Orthodox, who turn up at crime scenes, tragedies, natural disasters, collect bodies, try and get them ready for Jewish burials. But they end up wrecking crime scenes. They're not credible organizations when it comes to their testimonies. The founder of Zaka, ironically the group that has spread so many stories about dead babies and sexual violence, he committed suicide a few years ago when he was accused of mass child rape. They have a long history of being accused by Israeli media of trying to fundraise off of atrocities. And their volunteers came up with a lot of outlandish stories. A lot of stories, the ones you mentioned, etc., come from Zaka and another group called United Hatzalah. And Zaka is a group that has been caught again and again, their volunteers, again and again, lying about what happened on October 7th, claiming to have seen babies executed, beheaded, put in ovens, etc., which didn't happen. A lot of these stories come from Zaka and United Hatzalah. They've never apologized properly. They just say, it was an emotional day. And yet the media keeps using them as a source, these groups that have absolutely no expertise in these fields. What's astonishing is I can believe that on a day of tragedy and chaos like that, where the military are absent and complete amateurs are at crime scenes, I can get the chaos. I can get people saw things, got things wrong. But the beheaded baby story comes days later, and it's perpetuated for days on end. An Israeli reporter for I-24 first says a commander told her this story. They throw in, people don't realize this, not just 40 beheaded babies, Bassem. Do you know that one colonel called Vash, Golan Vash, he said that he personally witnessed 8 burned babies inside a kibbutz, and that he personally evacuated. He carried the baby out that was beheaded. No such baby exists. That video, Bassem, is still up. The video of him saying this is still up on the Israeli government's official Twitter feed. As of the day of recording today, it is still up on that feed. So this is not accidents. This is not fog of war. No. This is not just a bit of chaos and confusion. They deliberately took the most emotive subject to justify their genocide.
My favorite is that the whole idea about like baby in ovens, which was repeated by Mike Johnson, who's the Speaker of the House.
Repeated very recently,
only
again,
2 weeks ago
on CNN.
A couple of months ago. But here's the thing. The way that it's like, it was just like one of the rescuers where was so shocked and traumatized. So he was misrepresented. The only way that you saw something and you think it's a baby baked in oven, that you are on acid. There is no other explanation. It's not traumatization. I mean,
there is another explanation.
It's not traumatization.
You're a liar.
No, it's not.
I mean, you're a liar.
You're either a liar or you're on very, 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 very bad drugs. This is the kind of like acid will make you see. I don't know. I haven't tried it, but this is crazy. The fact that you openly say baked babies in ovens and it's like, sorry, he just. He was mistaken.
It got worse. They said the babies were hung on clotheslines.
Yeah, that's another baby. It's
insane.
No.
But the
baby is in oven. That's different from the baby on line clothes. It's different from the baby that was cut off from a pregnant woman in her womb. So these are 3 different babies. Get your facts checked.
Get my facts checked. And they're all, by the way, from these volunteer groups who are then
and they were all traumatized.
Hold on. Who are then quoted in the New York Times, in CNN, in all the media organizations, in the BBC, without journalists in the West doing the basic work to tell their readers, these guys have also said stuff that's completely discrediting them. If you or I were eyewitnesses and made up stories like this, we would be laughed out of court, we would be laughed out of the media, we would be laughed out of our jobs. Yet these people are still spreading the kind of crap.
And yet New York Times get the Pulitzer.
Using sources like this. So these stories, I just want to ask you one thing, which is...
By the way, New York Times, I can't cancel my subscription for you for over a year. You guys get us to pay $8 a month, and I'm trying to call their customer service, and I cannot cancel my subscription. It's horrible.
Have you taken that subscription money and put it into Azadeh subscription? He shamelessly asks small businessman CEO.
I'm part of Azadeh. I should be getting the money.
Free. Yes, you should have you have a free sub. Of course, he has a free sub, but you at home don't, so make sure you sign up. Look, I just want to ask a serious question. Funny, but serious. You are a father.
Can you actually be serious in this?
I have.
Can you?
I'm very serious. I'm always serious.
Listen
I
up.
have resting angry Muslim face. I have RAMF, Bassem. I have resting angry Muslim face. Even when I'm happy, I look angry.
I know, but the situations like this is where you really have to put logic behind you.
But I'm angry. No, but I'm angry because I'm a father. You're a father. They knew what they were doing by using babies as the way to justify. By the way, I should point out, recently in Rafah, we actually saw with our own eyes a decapitated baby.
But they don't care.
From an Israeli bomb.
But they're Palestinians.
But they're Palestinians.
That cancels out.
They don't count. But the tragic irony of lying about something so horrific to then go do violence in Gaza, which actually caused real decapitated babies. But they knew what they were doing when they said babies. That emotion that went round the world.
Because this is what happens. If you see a baby, what do you see? They can only do 3 things: smile, cry, and poop. That's it. There's no threat. But if you go in as a person seeing a baby and you take your knife, you you go through the skin, the tissue, the trachea, the spine, and then you do that 40 times, those are animals. And if they're animals, they deserve what they're getting. So now we can carpet bomb everybody.
Remember, Yoav Gallant used the phrase animals on October 8th. Just one last point I want to say on the baby front as a journalist. One, the people who said that stuff have never been held to account, the journalists who propagated it. There's no corrections.
No.
You know, Douglas Murray and John Podhoretz and all these pro-Israel pundits wrote columns in the media. There's no corrections appended. No one's gone back and put a correction at the bottom on a lot of these pieces. And number 2, I've been trying to say this to American interviewers in particular for a while. When the Israeli military lie again to you again and again and again, at some point, don't you say, fool me once, shame on me, right? Fool me, whatever the bloody phrase is. At some point, don't you say, we got to stop being propagandized. We got to stop buying this bullshit.
We say that, but it's people on the other side who want this comfortable lies in order to give them justification.
No, I understand.
To see what happens. But
we took years to stop believing police departments when they said, "Oh yeah, the black man pulled a gun on us at the traffic stop." Now we say, let's not believe the first police statement. But when Israeli generals are saying, Israeli colonels are saying, "I carried a beheaded baby in my arms," you should never trust that man again. He should be laughed out of all the court of public opinion and the media. Instead, we continue to platform them and give them weird respect and deference that we wouldn't give the North Korean military or the Russian military.
Dude, you already know how these people think. You are in a debate and you were booed when you mentioned Oxfam. So this is like people...
But that's what I'm saying. Those are the extremists. I'm talking about journalists who claim to be upholding, democratic skepticism, journalistic fact checks.
That doesn't work anymore. That doesn't work anymore.
So let's talk about a subject...
There are lies and frauds.
So let's talk about a big journalistic failure.
They're not even good comedians.
Let's talk about a big journalistic failure. If we're going to talk about the fallout from October 7th and some of the claims made, we can't not talk about sexual violence. Hugely contentious issue, provocative issue, emotional issue, understandably for a lot of people. And we need to talk about some of the kind of competing claims and credible claims and propaganda around this subject. But I just want to let viewers and listeners know that this discussion is going to talk about sexual violence. The specifics are disturbing, they are traumatizing, and if anyone listening or watching at home does need help on this issue, there's a list of mental health resources in our show notes for survivors of sexual violence and other harmful, traumatic experiences. It is a very serious and upsetting subject, we know that, but it's something we have to talk about. And I'm just going to start, because everyone, if you talk about this stuff, you immediately cause a rape deny, if you even try to have a discussion about what's happened since October 7th. And I just want to set the scene with a couple of things. Number one, the United Nations Commission of Inquiry put out their report last week, and they said, the week before last, and they said on this subject, the Commission identified patterns indicative of sexual violence in several locations and concludes that Israeli women were disproportionately subjected to these crimes. The Commission did not find credible evidence, however, that militants received orders to commit sexual violence, and so was unable to make conclusions on this issue. It says the Commission has not been able to independently verify allegations of rape due to this is important, due to a lack of access to victims, witnesses, and crime sites, and the obstruction of its investigation by the Israeli authorities. So, Bassem, as you know, you've been following this for the last 8 months. The Israeli government and some of its defenders abroad, people like Sheryl Sandberg and others, have been stressing that the world has ignored the voices of Israeli Jewish women who were attacked, assaulted, taken hostage, and allegedly raped en masse, they say, on October the 7th. And some people, and I would include myself in this bucket, I would say there's 3 types of groups. There's one group of people who say, you must accept that there was mass rape on October 7th and that Hamas used it as a weapon of war. It was all part of the plan. There's another group of people who say, nobody was raped on October 7th. It's all Israeli propaganda. And there's me, and I put myself in this bucket that says, maybe there was. But where is the investigation? Where is the independent investigation? Why are the Israelis blocking independent investigators? If you want me to accept the Israeli government's word for it, I will not. They say believe women. And we do believe women. But the problem is a lot of the reporting and a lot of the discourse has not involved women. It's involved Israeli spokespersons and evidence-free claims and UN investigators being blocked access.
There was a tweet by one of the propaganda Twitter accounts that is run by the Israeli military. I think it's called War Rooms or War Tactics, whatever. And on October 7th at 7 p.m., they had a tweet of pictures of Israeli women. And they said Hamas is using rape as a weapon. That was just as October 7th was happening. They planted this. And I just want to say something, and I know that we're going to get into this. This has been a technique that has been used forever. White people against black communities that have been using gendered accusations. And this is why something like the Atlanta Massacre in 1906 happened, Forsyth Massacre in 1912 happened, the Tulsa Massacre in 1921, Rosewood in Florida 1922. All of these were started by a rumor of a black man assaulting or raping a white woman, and that led to the decimation and the killing of whole black neighborhood, especially in Tulsa. It is a very old game, old techniques, and the fact that they still do it in the age of information, where people can find out for themselves, it is really heartbreaking. I know this is a very sensitive subject, but with any crime, it's all about the reporting and how credible it is. And when you find like someone like the New York Times having this article screams without words, I would call this basically journalism without facts. This is exactly what this is. Basically, Jeffrey Gettleman, who was the author of this, who was the Pulitzer winner, he came up on a video and he said, it's getting evidence is not my job. Evidence is a legal term. I just tell people information and stories and they come up. This is like me saying, I'm a doctor. Saving lives is not my role. Healing is a medical term. I'm a wellness poet. This is how bad it is. You cannot just say oh, I'm not a firefighter. I'm a flame dancer. This is crazy. I mean, what kind of integrity? What kind of professionality do we expect from you when you say he's an investigative journalist? It's like, hey, I'm sorry, I'm a chef. I know that my food tastes like shit. I'm a culinary artist. It doesn't work this way.
The irony of that New York Times piece was it was supposed to be the defining piece that made the case that A, mass rape happened, it was systematic, and B, that it was a Hamas order. And that piece has now been debunked, discredited. Multiple journalism professors have written an open letter saying the New York Times needs to investigate this piece. The witnesses have fallen apart.
Their own podcast, The Daily, they canceled their episode about the article because there was not enough evidence. And then the New York Times went crazy. I come back to the idea. It's like, evidence is a legal term. It's like, hey, I'm a pilot. Flying is an aviation term. I'm a gravity negotiator. If you crash, that's just turbulence expressing yourself.
It's worse. Gettleman said, my job is to move people. That is not the job of a journalist,
wow.
Actually. That's the job of a politician, of a propagandist,
so this is
of an activist. It's not the job of a journalist.
So it's like, hey, I'm a doctor. My job is not to heal people. My job is to cut people. This is how bad this is.
It goes against the very
This is the worst job
opinion
description you've ever said. And
he's not an opinion journalist. As an opinion journalist, you can move people with a wonderful column.
Yes.
He was an investigative journalist, Pulitzer Prize winner, goes to Israel with a former food writer.
Who's the food writer?
Adam Seller. And Adam Seller's uncle's partner, a woman called Anat Schwartz, a woman who'd been liking tweets about let's turn Gaza into a slaughterhouse. Former Israeli Air Force intelligence official. She was picked to write this front page story.
Maybe she was picked because her nephew showed up at the Jerusalem New York Times office or DoorDash. It's like, oh, you deliver food so well. I'm sure you can deliver the truth with the same efficiency.
By the way, as someone who has written for the New York Times, I've written op-eds. You have to jump through 100 hoops.
Are you name dropping now?
I'm name dropping. You have to jump through 100 hoops to get into the Times, and yet they dropped all of that for this huge piece that went around the world that bolstered support for Israel's genocide in Gaza at a moment when support globally was flagging.
Maybe you should work with Uber Eats, and that's what get you back.
Gag. At a time when support for the war was flagging, right? This piece comes out. And again, I want us to be able to talk about sexual violence. Clearly stuff happened. The UN says sexual violence. But the idea that, for example, one of the witnesses in the New York Times talked about a gang rape. This is the same woman who also said that women were beheaded. That never happened. And New York Times just cut that bit out.
And here's the thing.
Because the credibility of their witness was affected. They just didn't tell their
other
readers.
than New York Times, let's talk about Jake Tapper. That guy, he just transformed his show as a platform for every single lying scoundrel that was proven lying, like Rez Cohen and Sherry Mendes. These people were called liars by the Israeli media themselves. The Israelis themselves don't trust them.
I know you're...
Rez
wait. You need to give some context, Bassem. I'm waiting. Give some context.
Rez Cohen is a guy who has changed his testimony 5 times until he made it on 4th of January to be on Jake Tapper's show. This is exactly the definition of fake it till you make it. He faked his stories till he made it on
and when the New York Times...
And then Jake Tapper, he did it what is your team doing? What is your team doing fact checking? What do they do?
I want to put it in context. Shari Mendes, I should point out, is an Israeli with no experience.
Volunteer.
No experience in law, no experience in this field of sexual violence, no forensic experience, told lies about fetuses being ripped from wombs. So, Bassem, we could talk about Shari Mendes and her lack of credibility, Raz Cohen. We could talk about how the article... Again, I just want to be clear, because people are going to clip this and say, you're a rape denier. No. I'm saying that I want to hear what happened to Israeli women on October 7th, but what we're getting is bullshit. It's not helping the cause when your main investigative piece falls apart, when UN investigators are blocked from going into Israel. Let's have the investigation. Let's hear from people who are not Shari Mendez and Raz Cohen and Israeli officials one Israeli official, she put out pictures of Kurdish fighters and said these are Israeli women who were raped. I mean, how are we supposed to take this seriously? I want to take it seriously. Please give me more credible voices. And it's a sensitive subject. People get very upset. So I thought the best person to talk to on this, or one of the very best people to talk to on this, is Azadeh Moaveni. She teaches journalism at NYU. She's also a war correspondent who has served in war zones. And she also ran the gender program at the International Crisis Group. So she knows her stuff. She wrote a wonderful piece for the London Review of Books about how this issue of sexual violence is used and abused in war zones. Azadeh is here with us now. Welcome, Azadeh, to We're Not Kidding.
Thank you, Mehdi. Hi, Bassem.
I just want to start with your piece in the London Review of Books. What made you sit down and want to write that piece on such a controversial issue when you know that anything you say on this subject will get you attacked from one side or the other, especially from the pro-Israel side that says anyone who even wants to talk about rape or sexual violence outside of the context of Hamas did it as a weapon of war, you're a rape denier?
It's a good question. And many times in the throes of the reporting and the writing, I bitterly regretted it, I have to say. But I kept waiting for someone else to do it. I kept thinking, surely someone will come along, someone with experience reporting on women in conflict or rape and war, and do the sort of serious holistic treatment of how sexual violence is operating across all of this conflict, and sort of move it out of this incredibly sort of hypersensitized propagandistic space that this story had ended up in, for the sake of actually getting to the bottom of what happened to Israeli women, and also for the sake of looking beyond just October 7th and just see how sexual violence has spilled out on the Palestinian side, which we rarely hear about at all, and in Israeli society more widely as well. We don't hear about rapes in the displacement centers where people in the north, from the north who've been evacuated. Anyway, I was hoping someone else would do the big, serious, traditional sort of gender sensitive reporting, and it wasn't being done, and so I threw myself into it, perhaps for, I don't know, better or for worse.
And can I just ask as a follow-up, you said gender sensitive reporting. I mean, Bassem and I are sitting here talking about the New York Times coverage. We are two men. We have a political stance on this conflict. How do we talk about what went down on October the 7th in a way that both respects the fact that, yes, we should believe women, whether they're Jewish women, Palestinian women, white women, black women, Western women, Eastern women, but also the fact that we are being met with a blizzard of bullshit around some of this stuff too. So again, I'll say my position. My position is clearly, according to the UN and many investigations so far, sexual violence, gender-based violence took place on October the 7th and afterwards. But mass rape as a weapon of war, I'm still waiting for the evidence of that because the New York Times did not provide it. Multiple people who came out, like Physicians for Human Rights Israel, have now walked back from their original report saying, well, actually, we've realized a lot of the witnesses we relied on were not credible witnesses. So how do we talk about it in this way where we don't end with people saying, oh, you're just denying rape, you're just rape deniers?
Well, I think just taking the subject very seriously and scrutinizing what we have come to learn about what happened on that day versus the stories that were told and then instrumentalized about what happened on that day is serious ethical scrutiny. I mean, I think the conversation that you're having is doing that. Separating those two things out is really hard. It takes a lot of work, sort of absorbing what the UN said in these multiple reports, looking at the dozens of reports that have come out of Israel, Palestine, by different rights groups who've worked on this issue. But I guess to me, the sensitive thing is also widening it out. I mean, if we're looking at sexual violence in a conflict setting, we're not just looking at one day, although we will look at that one day. We have to also look at what it means that Israeli society is now saturated with guns because of its right-wing government and what that means for domestic violence at home. I mean, serious scholars and researchers who work on sexual violence look at it as a continuum. I mean, when you have a society at war like this, that violence is not going to be only confined to hurting women in the battlefield. It will be in detention centers, it will be in homes. And so just bringing that kind of serious sort of perspective to it.
Well, I know how sensitive it is, and I've been trying to talk to Mehdi about talking it, and he's rightly so. Of course, he's worried about talking it, and this is why you're bringing you an expert. But as a person, I'm just like sick and tired of like not being allowed to talk about anything because of the intimidation. It's as if like only Israeli kids are killed, only Israeli civilians are killed, only Israeli women are being subjected to sexual violence. And in the same time, I mean, like there's this slogan that I've been going on the internet forever. It's like every accusation is a confession. And this is one of the incidents where an accusation turned out to actually to be a confession, because everything that they have claimed that Palestinians did to their women, they have actually done it over the years to Palestinian women over and over, and also Palestinian men. And I think the New York Times finally mentioned that in a very long article that is consisted of 80 paragraphs, and they buried it in the 76th paragraph.
About men being raped in detention, Palestinian men,
Yeah, Palestinian men. Oh, of course, you have to talk about Palestinian.
Sorry,
because the word Palestinian seems to cancel out whatever atrocities is being done to them.
I interviewed a Democratic congressman recently, and I told him about these allegations of rape with hot metal rods against Palestinian men. He said, I never knew any of this. I didn't know any of this. It's amazing. A member of Congress claimed they didn't even know about what's happening.
You said Palestinian prisoners are being raped to death by Israeli soldiers?
Yes, this is a report in the New York Times last week.
Okay. I don't believe that to be true. Nonetheless, the question.
A 41-year-old detainee said the interrogators made me sit on something like a hot metal stick, and it felt like fire. He said another detainee died after they put the electric stick up his anus.
No, it's repulsive.
And yet, Azadeh, we've had this kind of onslaught of coverage. And I just want to, you said broaden it beyond.
Okay, I'm going to stop you. This is exactly how how they react to you when they tell them about this. When they tell them that like a horrible atrocity happened on the other side to the Palestinians.
They're not deniers.
They said, oh, this is terrible, horrible. Oh my God, let's talk now about October 7th. Let's talk about the Israeli hostages. Let's talk about
and we don't
the women.
call them rape deniers.
Yeah, exactly. No, they will say, oh, this is the best reaction you will ever get. They will not tell you, oh, it didn't happen. First of all, they will deny it. It's like, oh, wow. Oh, we need to look into this. This is terrible. Now let's go back to the subject and talk about the stuff that we care about, because this is exactly the same way about Kirby and Miller and all of those like White House correspondents. Oh, we are investigating. This is terrible. But let's go back and talk about how the Israel is being victimized.
So what's interesting, Azadeh, is you know this phrase, whataboutism, which is often used on all sides of the conflict. And I'm often accused of whataboutism. And what's interesting with whataboutism is the definition of whataboutism is to try and point to something over there. Well, what about this when you're talking about that as a way to distract? When I talk about sexual violence against Palestinians, it's not whataboutism, because it's part and parcel of the same thing. I want an investigation of all sexual violence. I'm not dismissing what happened on October the 7th. I want to know what happened. If Hamas did carry out these atrocities as a weapon of war, we should know about it. The problem is, how do we get to the bottom of that when you have the Israelis, an unreliable narrator, the Israeli government, they say believe Israeli women. Sure, as long as they're not members of the Israeli government, because I don't believe any members of the Israeli government or military after all the lies they've told. And of course, some Israeli women have denied this stuff, including the sisters of Gal Abdush, the woman at the center of the New York Times piece. They say our sister wasn't raped. The New York Times made this up. So where does
it's like America says like no. You were. It's
we'll tell you.
It happened to you. It happened to you.
So Azadeh, how do we then respond in a way that is consistent across the board, so we can talk about all of it at once?
Well, it's certainly not whataboutism for people who do this, as scholars and lawyers and international lawyers and conflict researchers. I mean, in any conflict setting, when you're looking at sexual violence, you look at sexual violence committed on all sides, because that's the picture of the conflict. When, I work in Nigeria, I look at what the Nigerian military does to women in detention who've been part of Boko Haram. I look at what Boko Haram does. You look at the whole cycle of the conflict, because it is a conflict. It's constantly, the two sides are constantly hurting each other and responding to each other. So certainly it's not whataboutism to try and see how violence against women, threats of it, reporting about it, instrumentalization of it operates within the conflict itself. I mean, that's what we do everywhere, whether it's Syria or Iraq or even Ukraine. It's in this one particular conflict that all of our methods and our standards that we've accumulated over decades of this kind of work are suspended, and we're like in a totally different territory.
So a very important point there, that they've been suspended. We've accepted testimonies and reports and sweeping statements. Sheryl Sandberg made a movie featuring people from Zaka who have been discredited, and I would say
and they featured Palestinians prisoners who were under torture, and they're using that as evidence, and the White House goes and screen that stuff as evidence. And the thing is, this is what
torture.
This is
what happened to Western values. Evidence from torture.
No. Palestinian cancels out.
Yes.
So here's the thing about like whataboutism. Israel is like someone going into a coffee shop, killing the barista, and so like, what did you do? It's like, oh, we're not going to talk about my cold coffee. This is exactly what Israel does. Is that they do all of these atrocities, and it all has to be. This is like Israel is Karen on steroids. It's just like me, my safety, my problem, my feeling, and everything else have to disintegrate.
Azadeh made a very good point about kind of this is the way we've treated this conflict uniquely, and Israel always claims, oh, you treat us differently. Actually, we treat you better. You get away with stuff that other countries don't get away with. And Ukraine you mentioned, and I'm fascinated in your piece, you mentioned something that I didn't know, I had to go away and look it up, that the Ukrainian human rights ombudsman, the chief in charge of that's our ally, Ukraine, was actually fired and actually criticized by Ukrainian lawmakers for exaggerating stories about sexual violence by the Russians against Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians were like, you're making us look bad by exaggerating these stories. And I looked at that, I thought, wow, but if I said that about Israel, I'm a rape denier. Here's our ally, Ukraine. And the fact is, it happens in every war zone. Governments lie.
Yes, they make allegations of sort of widespread rape on a scale that is often times 100 or times 1,000 more of what turns out to be actual cases, and then have a very awkward time walking it back. And that's not to discount the difficulty of reporting and sort of investigating rape and sexual violence in conflict zones. I mean, it's incredibly hard. You don't have, as in this case, you often don't have forensic evidence. You often don't have witnesses. And so it is extraordinarily difficult trying to piece it together for the sake of any investigation, whether it's in Ukraine or whether it's in Syria. And there's, of course, the fear of women to reports because there will be terrible stigma. There's like war trauma that fragments memories. It's very complex. But also, it is complicated by governments instrumentalizing it so they can mobilize their publics. I mean, rape taps into our deepest fears in any society. So it's hugely effective as a sort of mobilizing tactic when you need to galvanize your public to commit atrocities that perhaps they're not ready to commit without some sort of justification. And so it serves this purpose as well in many wars, not this one. I mean, we've seen, Ethiopia is a conflict in which rape has been rampant and largely ignored.
So what of the things that there is bothering me is the fact that, and I said at the beginning of the show, is that now all of these lies are becoming cemented into truth. They're cementing into documentaries, they're cementing into articles, and now it is the official statement because it is being parroted by American officials. Like the documentary by Sheryl Sandberg, now it is, everybody's going away with that. Now, years from now, that will be the memory of the world. What do you say about this documentary by Sheryl Sandberg?
I mean, Sheryl Sandberg has herself said that she has no expertise on this, even though I think she went on to brief like 5 different parliaments in Europe about sexual violence. So she's a strange sort of example of the sexual violence entrepreneur, someone who just shows up and is a sort of overnight expert and is sort of invited into halls of power because of the state that they're doing advocacy on behalf of, essentially. But what I think is striking about her film is that it makes the case that has been dismantled in the New York Times reporting, and it makes a case that is directly contradicted in the Commission of Inquiry report that was just released, which makes it very, very clear that there was sexual violence on October 7th, but it did not amount to a crime against humanity. There is not the evidence to say or show that it was part of a widespread attack against civilians. So the UN has put out its report, it has done its investigation, and it contradicts what Sheryl Sandberg's film claims, and yet Kamala Harris invites this film into the halls of American power. So it's just as from a journalistic perspective, as a professor of journalism, I feel incredible dissonance. I mean, this is an administration that rails against the threat that disinformation, brings to our democracy, and yet it's sort of trafficking in it.
And one last question for you, Azadeh, before I let you go. Do you also teach journalism? You're not just a journalist. We had a bunch of journalism professors write open letter to the Times saying, deal with this piece, this screams without words piece that has been debunked on many levels. They haven't kind of revoked it. They haven't apologized for it. Interestingly, the Times of London, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, right-wing newspaper, recently did an investigation. It's the first time I've seen in the mainstream media, Bassem, saying what we've been saying, asking some of the questions. The headline was, Israel says Hamas weaponized rape. Does the evidence add up? The subhead of the article says the Israeli government insists that Hamas formally sanctioned sexual assault on October the 7th, but investigators say the evidence does not stand up to scrutiny. And Azadeh, the journalists who wrote that have had to make their social media accounts private because pro-Israel trolls are now attacking them as rape deniers. Reporters for Murdoch's Times of London are now being accused simply because they're saying, well, the evidence doesn't stand up. What do you make as a professor of journalism about how the Western media has covered this story, especially the New York Times?
Well, the New York Times story, I mean, I think we must recognize, features multiple problems, just one of which, if it was on any other subject, would have led to a reporter stepping down, being taken off a beat, a kind of formal reassessment of the reporting, as the Times did with its Iraq War coverage, the sort of giving back of awards that we saw with the Caliphate podcast. If just one of the problems that this piece is burdened by, I think, had come to pass with another subject, the Times would have admitted to journalistic malpractice and adjusted its reporting in a significant way.
Azadeh, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate your expertise.
Thank you both.
Thank you so
Take
much.
care.
Bassem, fascinating, important discussion with Azadeh there, because you don't hear, I wish we'd see more of her on some of our mainstream outlets talking about this subject in a nuanced way and mentioning Palestinians, as you did. Because, of course, the UN report that we've mentioned many times on this show, I urge people to go look at the UN COI report, Commission of Investigation, Commission of Inquiry. It said that specific forms of sexual and gender-based violence are part of ISF, Israeli Security Force, operating procedures. You put it so well. Every accusation is a confession. We haven't been able to find evidence that Hamas used sexual violence as a weapon of war. We do know that there are credible claims of sexual violence on October the 7th. But here the UN is saying that the ISF use it as part of their operating procedures. This is what they do.
They're their MO. Their MO, man.
But no one cares. But no one cares. As you say, this is the problem. But we care, which is why we did this episode today. We'll get attacked for this episode heavily. What's new for you and I? We tried to do it in a factual way. I urge people to go look at the UN report, which might be, some of our viewers might not like what's in the UN report. It's very critical of the Palestinian side, of the Israeli side. It calls out Israeli war crimes, Hamas war crimes. It calls out sexual violence on both sides. And look, I would just say to people at home, if you truly care about women, care about all women, and if you care about what happened to Israeli women on October 7th, then support an investigation. If you don't support the Israeli government allowing in independent investigators to investigate stuff, don't pretend you care about the stuff. It's just a rhetorical weapon to justify violence in Gaza, unfortunately.
Good old propaganda.
Well, we've tried to debunk some of the propaganda on civilian deaths, on babies, on sexual violence. There's a lot more out there. We can't do it justice. But we will keep talking about this subject, Bassem, as long as you'll let me come to your beautiful city and talk to you. We'll keep talking about it. Bassem, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
We're Not Kidding is a Zateo production. I'm your host, Mehdi Hasan, and today's co-host was Bassem Youssef. Our executive producer is Misha Youssef. Our producer and editor is Frank Capello. Our music was composed by Andy Clausen. Our design is by Alicia Tatone, and the title card animation is by Ehsan Mezgal.